you, Thomas. So as Thomas said, the title of my talk is Falsehood Without Reference to the Unreal. And this is my attempt at capturing Plato's account of falsehood. So Plato is very interested in the topic of falsehood, and he discusses a variety of falsehood puzzles. And in the Sophist, he also provides an account of falsehood, which is meant to solve at least some of those puzzles. Now, in my talk today, I have two aims. The first aim is to show that Plato's account of falsehood is philosophically interesting, especially when compared to modern accounts. The second aim is to show that it solves one particularly important falsehood puzzle. And here we shall see that I disagree with the existing interpretations. So here is the program. I will first set out what I think is the problem of falsehood that underlies various falsehood puzzles. I will then present Plato's solution to this problem by way of his account of falsehood. So that is T1 on the handout. I hope that everyone has the handout. Then I will zoom in on what I take to be the first falsehood puzzle in the Sophist. So that is T2 on the handout. And then finally, I will argue that Plato's account of falsehood solves this first falsehood puzzle. So no time to waste. Let's get started with the problem of falsehood. Now, I take it that this problem really focuses on the question of how it is possible to say or believe a falsehood. And I will follow Plato in focusing on saying, but we can talk more about believing in the Q&A if you want. Now, to illustrate the problem, I will use as an example the sentence, Theaetetus is flying, which Plato himself uses. Theaetetus is one of the interlocutors in the Sophist, and this is meant to be an obviously false sentence. So in reality, Theaetetus is sitting on the ground talking to the other interlocutors, and he is not flying. Now, I take it that the problem of falsehood arises because of a clash between two intuitions about this sentence. On the one hand, there is the intuition that the sentence says something, because after all, you understand what it is that the sentence says. And on the other hand, the sentence says something which is not a reality, because after all, it's a false sentence, and in reality, Theaetetus is not flying. So this then gives rise to the question, how can what this sentence says be on the one hand something, and on the other hand not a reality? Because it seems that for it to be something, it must somehow be a reality. But on the other hand, for it not to be a reality, if it's not a reality, then it's hard to see how it could be something. Now, this question becomes all the more pressing, I think, in the context of ancient Greek philosophy. And I think there are two factors that contribute to this. The first factor is that in ancient Greek, truth and falsehood are described in terms of being and not being. So that a true sentence, such as Theaetetus is sitting, says the things which are, whereas a false sentence, such as Theaetetus is flying, says the things which are not. So the Greek often, though not always, uses a plural here. The second factor is the towering influence of Parmenides over ancient Greek philosophy. So Parmenides forcefully argued that it is impossible for things which are not to be. And I think that these two questions, these two factors conspire to bring to the attention of the ancient Greek thinker the question of how is it possible to say the things which are not while at the same time saying something rather than saying nothing at all. And this is what I take to be the problem of falsehood. Now, you might think that's an easy problem. I already know the solution. And if that is what you think, then it is likely that you have in mind what I take to be a typical modern solution to this problem. And this modern solution is to say that the sentence Theaetetus is flying says something in that it expresses a proposition. But on the other hand, the sentence Theaetetus is flying says something which is not a reality in that it expresses a false proposition. So what is characteristic of this solution, I think, is that it in fact accepts an idea which underlies and motivates the falsehood puzzles, namely that a falsehood is an entity of some sort, an entity that has the feature of being something, of existing somehow on the one hand, and on the other hand of being false. And in this solution, the role of that entity is played by a proposition. And now one of my claims today, but I'm not the only one to claim this, I mean another someone who has claimed this is Paolo Crivelli in his monograph on the Sophist, is that Plato's solution, in a way, Plato's solution to the problem of falsehood is more radical in that it does not accept this idea. Indeed, it rejects this idea that a falsehood is an entity of some sort. Now, what then is Plato's account of falsehood? Well, this account has two components, or can be divided into two components, I think. So the first is an account of the basic linguistic units of saying, namely of sentences, of logoi. And the second component is specifically an account of false sentences. So let us look at these components in turn. Well, but before that, to further general points. So as we shall see, Plato's account preserves the intuition that a false sentence in some way says the things which are not. And as I said, this intuition is encoded in the description of falsehood in ancient Greek. And we shall see that Plato's account explains how the false sentence Theaetetus is flying is a sentence and therefore says something, while it is also false and therefore in some way says, in a way that is to be specified, says the things which are not. Okay, so let us then turn to the account of sentences. Now, Plato starts by dividing the constituents of sentences, namely words, into verbs and names, or perhaps nouns. So in the context of this analysis, onomata acquires the more specific meaning of names or nouns. Now, we do not get a full analysis of what verbs and names are, but in the context of the examples that Plato gives, words which signify actions are verbs, whereas words which signify those who perform actions are names. Now then, Plato then points out that successions of merely verbs or merely names do not constitute sentences. So when I say walks, runs, sleeps, just verbs, then I haven't produced a sentence. And the same applies when I say lion, stag, horse, just names, I haven't produced a sentence. And then Plato says that a sentence is an interweaving, a symploche of verbs with names, which I take to be a syntactically correct combination of at least one verb and one name. And the example that Plato gives is man learns, the sentence man learns, which contains a name, man, and the verb learns. Okay, so now Plato then makes what I take to be a very important distinction between, on the one hand, saying, legein, and on the other hand, naming, onomatzein. And I will read a little bit of text here. So for he who says man learns, as opposed to walks, runs, sleeps, or lion, stag, horse, already indicates something about things which are or are coming to be, or have come to be, or are to come. And by interweaving verbs with names, does not merely name, but says something. And we gave the name sentence to this weaving. Now I take the point here to be that the sentence man learns, as opposed to the successions of merely verbs or merely names, not only names something, but also says something. Now what is very clear is that the successions of merely verbs and merely names do not say anything. What is, I think, left somewhat indeterminate is whether these successions name something. But in any case, the sentence both names and says something. And I take it that in this context, naming something amounts to mentioning or referring to something. And I take it that the sentence man learns names what is signified by its name constituent, so man in this case. Now, it could be that it is also meant to name what is signified by its verb constituent, namely learns. But that is at least terminologically less obvious, because it seems that there is a connection between the name constituent and the operation of naming. Now then, the sentence man learns also says something, and given what we see in this text, I take that to mean that it says that something is the case. So the sentence man learns says that man learns. Now we then get two further points. The first being that sentences are of something or about something, and these two are equivalent, I take it. And then we get two examples to illustrate this, which turn out to be of or about the same thing. So we get the sentence Theaetetus is sitting, which is of or about Theaetetus, and the sentence Theaetetus is flying, which is of or about, which is also of or about Theaetetus. So I take it that a sentence is of or about what is signified by its name constituent, which we might call its subject. Now we then get another point, which is of course going to be very important, namely that sentences are of a certain quality, namely they are true or false. So I think it's clear that Plato is speaking of declarative sentences here, and then apply to the example. We do now get a differentiation, because Theaetetus is sitting is true and Theaetetus is flying is false. Okay, so let's then turn to false sentences. Now, as I said, Plato's account preserves the intuition that a false sentence in some way says the things which are not. And he does so in terms of the converse use of the verb to be, einai, namely a use that one might call being about, where one thing is about another thing. Now, this is a bit of a technical usage of the verb to be, but given this usage, to say that sitting is about Theaetetus is to say that Theaetetus is sitting. Whereas to say that flying is not about Theaetetus is to say that Theaetetus is not flying. So the position of the predicate and the subject are inverted. Now, one might be worried here about the is not in the claim, in the sentence that Theaetetus is not about, sorry, that flying is not about Theaetetus, because after all, we are in the context of the Sophist, where we are worried about not being. We want an account of not being. But before giving his account of falsehood, Plato has already explained that this is an innocuous occurrence of is not, and that to say that flying is not about Theaetetus is just to say that the attribute flying is different from all the attributes which are about Theaetetus. So he has already analyzed this is not. Now, this then helps Plato to explain the sense in which a false sentence says what is not, and also to make that what is not innocuous. So because what happens in a false sentence is that what is not about its subject is said to be about its subject. Now, to illustrate this, let us look into two small bits of text, starting with a true sentence, which is supposed to say the things which are. Plato says about the true sentence, Theaetetus is sitting, that it says that the things which are about you. Now, I take it from this that a true sentence, such as Theaetetus is sitting, says the things which are, in that something which is about Theaetetus, namely sitting, is said to be about Theaetetus. Now, a false sentence, such as Theaetetus is flying, on the other hand, and I'm here quoting again, says the things which are not as things which are about you. Now, it's clear from the context that we have to think about you here, and a few lines down that is made explicit. So I take it from this that the false sentence Theaetetus is flying says the things which are not, in that something which is not about Theaetetus, namely flying, is said to be about Theaetetus. Okay, so this gives us an explanation of how a false sentence says the things which are not. Now, there is, for those of you who were here when Paolo Crivelli gave a talk earlier this year, it's interesting to note that things get a little more complicated once you consider negative false statements, such as Theaetetus is not sitting. It's not quite obvious how those sentences say what is not in an analogous fashion. But it's an interesting complication that I don't want to consider today, but I just want to mention it because Paolo discussed it in this very colloquium earlier this year. Now, how does this compare to the modern solution that I introduced earlier, which says that the sentence Theaetetus is sitting expresses a false proposition? Now, I take it that with Plato's solution, the sentence Theaetetus is flying, might have said sitting before, but I meant flying. Theaetetus is flying says something in that it is a sentence which says that flying is about Theaetetus. But on the other hand, it says the things which are not, in that what is not about Theaetetus, namely flying, is said to be about Theaetetus. And these two, I think, are clearly compatible now. So we have a solution. Now, what is interesting about Plato's account of falsehood is that falsehood very clearly depends both on the world and on our saying. So it's not that we can take for granted a false proposition that is expressed by the false sentence, but we explain falsehood in terms of the sentence and the world, such that the falsehood, as it were, only arises once we start speaking about the world. And in fact, Plato explicitly says this before giving his account of falsehood. So he says that there would be no falsehood if not being did not mix with sentences, with logoi. So I think that's a very significant statement. Okay, so now some further important takeaways from this. I take it that the sentence Theaetetus is flying does not name or refer to something which is not a reality. What it does instead is that it names Theaetetus, and in doing so, it secures reference to something which is a reality, because after all, Theaetetus is a reality. And then it says about Theaetetus that he is flying. And hence it says, and hence what is not about Theaetetus is said to be about him. And this explains the sense in which it says what is not. Okay, so that brings me to the third part of my talk, the first, what I take to be the first falsehood puzzle in the Sophist. Yeah, before I get into that, some background to this puzzle. So in the Sophist, the interlocutors try to define the Sophist as someone who induces false beliefs by means of appearances. And this attempted definition then leads the interlocutors to consider a series of puzzles about not being and falsehood. And Plato's account of falsehood at the end of the Sophist is meant to solve those puzzles, even though Plato doesn't explicitly return to the puzzles. Now, today I want to focus on what I take to be the first falsehood puzzle, which is text, it should actually be text 2, apologies, on your handout. Now, the conclusion of this first puzzle is that it is impossible to express what is not, sthengestai me on. Now, I kept saying that I take this to be a falsehood puzzle. And the reason for that is that some interpreters deny that this is a falsehood puzzle. For instance, Paolo Crivelli denies that this is, argues that this is not a falsehood puzzle. So according to Crivelli, Plato actually accepts the argument that constitutes this, what I call a puzzle, and in particular accepts the conclusion of it. So Crivelli thinks, as far as I understand it, that this argument in some sense tells you what is right about Parmenides' position. Now, it's beyond the scope of this talk to give a full argument against this and in favor of my view that it is a falsehood puzzle, but I will just mention 4 reasons, and then I want to focus on the final reason, which is really what I'm concerned with today. So my first reason is that, but of course we can discuss this further in the discussion round. Now, my first reason is that the conclusion of this argument, namely that it's impossible to express what is not, is naturally understood to imply, or perhaps even to mean, that it is impossible to express a falsehood. And I think that this can be backed up textually. There are parallels that support this reading. So the conclusion can be understood to say, to make the paradoxical claim that it's impossible to express a falsehood. Now, moreover, as a falsehood puzzle, it is relevant to the context, because after all, the reason they go over these arguments is precisely that they want to define the sophist as someone who induces false beliefs by means of appearances. Now, moreover, there's also a striking resemblance with other falsehood, well, what are definitely falsehood puzzles elsewhere in Plato, in particular one in the Theaetetus, which I think also speaks in favor of treating this as a falsehood puzzle. And moreover, and this will be what I will focus on today, I think that Plato's account of falsehood shows what is wrong with this argument. And it gives a good explanation of why the conclusion doesn't follow, if the conclusion is understood to say that it is impossible to express a falsehood. So let us then look into the puzzle. So the puzzle consists of 2 parts, or can be divided into 2 parts, which I label A and B. And the conclusion of part A is that the phrase "what is not" (tome on) is not a name, onoma, of something. Now, part B then builds on part A, and concludes that it is impossible to express what is not. And this is the overall conclusion of the puzzle, which I take to mean that it's impossible, or to imply at least that it is impossible to express a falsehood. So let us first look into part A. Now, part A opens with a question, namely, what should this name to onomatuto, what is not to me on, be applied to? And the interlocutors then arrive at the answer that the alleged name, what is not a name of something. It should not be applied to anything, for the alleged name, what is not a name of something. That's the answer. Now, we then get an argument for this answer, and that goes as follows. First, it is argued that the phrase "what is not" cannot be applied to a being, cannot be correctly applied to a being. Then it is argued that the word "something" can only be correctly applied to beings. And from this, it is then inferred that the phrase "what is not" and the word "something" cannot be applied to the same thing, which is then taken to imply that the phrase "what is not" is not a name of something. Now, I take it that this is a sound argument if we understand what is not, the phrase "what is not," as meaning what is not real or what does not exist. But this is really worth discussing, I think. I'd like to know what you think about this. But then it seems to be a sound argument. Now, it seems to me that an important implication of the conclusion of this argument is that it is impossible to name something which is not real. And why is this an implication? Well, suppose that it were possible to name something which is not real, then the phrase "what is not" would be a name of that thing. But the argument has excluded that the phrase "what is not" is a name of something. So maybe another way of putting this would be to say that if it were possible to name something which is not real, then the extension of the phrase "what is not" should be non-empty. But the argument has just concluded that the extension of the phrase "what is not" is in fact empty. So this is really, it's a little bit tricky, I think, but it is, I think it is going to play an important role in the transition to part B of the argument. So it seems to me that this does follow, but it seems to me also not very easy to see when it follows. Okay, so that brings me to part B, which which is meant to build on part A and then adds two further premises. So the first of those premises is that whoever does not say something says nothing. And the second premise that is added is that whoever says nothing does not speak. And it is then concluded from this that whoever expresses what is not does not speak. And I take that to be equivalent to the overall conclusion of the argument, namely that it is impossible to express what is not, which I take to imply that it's impossible to express a falsehood. Now, it seems to me that premise 2 and premise 3 are true, but that in order to get a valid argument, we need another premise. And presumably that premise is supposed to be based on part A. And what is that premise? Well, I think it's clear that it must be the premise that whoever expresses what is not does not say something. With that premise added, we get a valid argument. So let us now take stock. So we have part A and part B. Part A concludes that the phrase "what is not" a name, an onoma of something. Part B then builds on this to arrive at the conclusion that it is impossible to express what is not. And it seems to do so by using as an implicit premise, which is supposed to be based on part A, on the conclusion of part A, that whoever expresses what is not does not say something. Now, I have argued that part A is a sound argument and that part B is a valid argument. And so it seems that things must go wrong in the transition from part A to part B. And what I want to suggest is that, yes, what I want to suggest is that the conclusion of part A might seem to support this first premise of part B, which is meant to build on the conclusion of part A. But that Plato's account of falsehood explains why the conclusion of part A does not, in fact, support the first premise of part B. So it explains what goes wrong here. It gives a diagnosis of the argument. It doesn't just say, okay, this is wrong, but it actually gives some kind of explanation of what goes wrong. Now, so how does this work? Well, my suggestion is that the puzzle in some way conflates saying with naming. And because in part A, we are concerned with naming, and the conclusion of part A is that the phrase what is not a name of something. Whereas part B, and specifically the first premise of part B, is concerned with saying, and it says that whoever expresses what is not does not say something. Now, but what exactly is this conflation? Well, specifically, I think that the conclusion of part A might seem to support the first premise of part B if one conceives of saying a falsehood as naming something which is not real. Because I have argued that the conclusion of part A rules out the possibility of naming something which is not real. I take that to be an implication of the conclusion of part A. And it would then seem to follow, given that conception of saying a falsehood, that whoever tries to say a falsehood fails to say something at all, which is precisely what the first premise of part B says. So what then is the diagnosis of Plato's account? Well, first of all, saying what is not, in the sense of saying a falsehood, does not amount to naming something which is not real. And the first premise of part B is incorrect, because Plato's account of falsehood explains that whoever expresses what is not in the sense of saying a falsehood does say something. That's we get an explanation of that. We get an explanation of that in Plato's account, and this is perfectly compatible with the conclusion of part A being correct, i.e., with it being the case that the phrase "what is not" is not the name of something, and indeed also with the implication of that conclusion being correct, namely that what is not real cannot be named. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my talk with some conclusions and directions for future research. So I have argued that Plato's account solves the first falsehood puzzle by attacking its underlying conception of saying a falsehood as naming or referring to something which is not real. Now, a question that one might then ask is, to what extent can Plato's account deal with other falsehood puzzles, such as some of the puzzles that you get in the Theaetetus, which have a more epistemic character. There is also that puzzle in the Theaetetus, which I mentioned earlier, which I think is strikingly similar to this puzzle, but you have other puzzles which have a more epistemic character. And does Plato's account also help to solve those? Now, I've also argued that Plato's account of falsehood is interestingly different from modern accounts which involve propositions or other entities which can be false, which might also be states of affairs, for instance. And here, one might ask the question, well, how does Plato's account compare to other ancient accounts and also to specific modern accounts? And maybe with respect to the ancient accounts, I mean, Aristotle would be an interesting case, but also the Stoics, because the Stoics, in a way, so I said that the propositional solution is modern, but propositions go all the way back to most explicitly present in the ancients already in the Stoics. So one might think that the Stoics would give a similar or same solution. And with respect to modern accounts, one might look at accounts that also try to satisfy some of the constraints that Plato has, and specifically not introducing false entities to explain falsehoods. And I think one particularly interesting example here is Russell's attempt at explaining falsehood, which has some similarities to Plato's account. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you for your attention.